It's nice because I hate wearing winter clothes, but it's not
Oh my
good
goodness. Oh my
at,
goodness.
at any rate. When I
Yeah.
was a child, there was this the saying like "Abril lluvias mil," like it always rains in April. We haven't had any of that
Oh my
at
goodness.
all. So, yeah.
Well, I see that Francis Roberts-Gregory has joined us, so welcome. Maybe since we have people joining from all over the world right now, if you would all please just say hi in the chat with your name and where you're joining from today. I think that would be fun to see where people are coming in from. And then we'll get started here. Francis, do you need me to add you as a co-host? I didn't know if you'd be sharing slides or anything like that.
Yes, hi everyone. Good to see all your beautiful faces on this Friday morning. And yes, I did have a few slides.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. So I've just made you co-host. So happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to April's Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators chat. I'm Jennifer Atkinson, one of the co-hosts of this group, and I'm joining today from Seattle, which sits on the unceded Sammamish and Duwamish lands and waters, which are part of the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And I had a student recently share a cool resource with me, which I'll drop in the chat. So this is a great resource for digital gatherings like this, where people are joining from all over. It's Native Land Digital, which is an indigenous led and has an indigenous executive and board of directors. And it helps us understand and acknowledge whose land we're on, wherever you are, at least on the North American continent. And then that second link, of course, the importance of land acknowledgements isn't just about saying that we're somewhere, but focusing on how we can support local tribes. So that second link is from Seattle. We have a group, Real Rent Duwamish, which is a really cool way for people to compensate those communities for their land and resources and livelihood. So I hope you'll look up similar opportunities to support Indigenous-led efforts like that one wherever you reside. So I am just thrilled today to welcome Francis Roberts-Gregory, or Robert, is it Robert-Gregory or Roberts? Now there's an S or not an S. So Robert Gregory is a PhD candidate in society and environment at UC Berkeley and a future faculty fellow at Northeastern University School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. Francis is a feminist political ecologist, environmental educator, and eco-womanist ethnographer. Her doctoral research explores how women of color in Gulf Coast Louisiana navigate contradictory relationships with energy and petrochemical industries, resist environmental racism, and advocate for environmental, energy, and climate justice. And she's also a member of the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal Coalition. So I just want to let everybody who's joining us know that if this is your first time with us, we're a fairly informal discussion group. And so this is really, led by our the sort of energy it comes from all of our participants. So I will help moderate if you want to either raise your hand or unmute yourself. And after we hear a little bit from Francis about her work, we'll just open it up for questions, for contributions, for other ideas. It's a great way, as always, to network and share resources and ideas and help troubleshoot our research and so forth. So with that, welcome, Francis, and I'll hand the screen over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be with you all here today. The presentation I'm going to share today is actually one that's new for me, some ideas that I'm working on. So I'm really excited to get your feedback and also learn from your own experiences. So at this time, I will attempt to share my slides. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my slides at this time. And so, yeah, today's presentation will focus on some feminist tools for collective care, security, and healing justice. And as Jennifer mentioned, I'm currently a future faculty fellow in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. And yeah, just really excited. So I first always like to begin my presentations with a land acknowledgement. And so although I am a future faculty fellow at Northeastern, I'm currently based in New Orleans. And the traditional term for the New Orleans region is actually Bobancha. It's a Choctaw word, which means land of many tongues. And this region was historically home to many indigenous people. This was um, a port region. And many of these communities include the Chitimacha, the Choctaw, later the Homa, the Caddo, the Tunica, Biloxi, and many others. And also I should say that this region is home to many Afro-diasporic and Caribbean folk who came here involuntary and some later voluntary. So today, as I mentioned, we'll discuss some feminist tools such as autoethnography and also the use of new media to promote emotional resiliency, healing justice, and post-traumatic growth in climate justice classrooms. And I would say for educators and students. I will also reflect on my experiences engaging high school, early college, undergraduate and graduate students at Tulane University, Bard Early College, and the University for Peace in Costa Rica. And then I hope that we can collectively explore ways that as climate educators, environmentalists, activists, we can cope with violence in and outside of the classroom, particularly when it's perpetuated by students, parents, and administrators who might be challenged by creative and abolitionist pedagogies. So a bit more about myself. So I identify as a feminist political ecologist, a feminist climate activist. I actually have ties to 3 environmental justice communities in New Jersey, North Carolina, and Georgia. I did not always know that I wanted to become a feminist climate activist. In undergrad, I actually was a part of a community service sorority. I participated in many civic engagement activities, many internships. And I was really influenced by one particular internship with the National Center for Atmospheric Research called Significant Opportunities in Atmospheric Research and Science. And through this internship, I was actually able to conduct participatory action research with indigenous communities in Gulf Coast, Louisiana, as well as partner with Georgia State University and one of my mentors there, Dr. Timothy Hawthorne, who was there previously, I should say, to understand green space accessibility and the importance of university community partnerships. And so we worked with the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance to better understand barriers and opportunities for green space accessibility. And that was really, once again, a life transformative experience where I joined a community geography collective. And so fast forward, I completed my graduate studies at the University of California, Berkeley in society and environment. And over time, I realized that I really had to center my positionality, my intersectional identities, and really center my voice as a Black feminist activist. And so my doctoral research actually utilized feminist activist ethnography and also what I'm calling eco-womanist autoethnography. And really, this is a disruptive and improvisational practice which recenters embodied knowledge subjectivity and also pushes back at epistemic injustice and this idea that BIPOC communities do not care about the environment and do not have critical solutions for environmental energy and climate justice. And so as a feminist scholar activist, I actually conducted in-depth conversational interviews with over 50 Black and Indigenous women working at the intersections of environmental energy and climate justice. My interviews were very long. They lasted sometimes, an hour to 5 hours. Folk in the South love to talk. And that's great because when we talk about interviews, we can also think of interviews as, or I should say feminist interviews as a way to promote counter history, also as a form of critical storytelling. I also served as the project manager for the Gulf Equity Watercourse Project at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and conducted participant observation through this position. And I also, over time, documented my evolution into an environmental educator and digital storyteller, because I did not always identify with terms such as environmental educator, storyteller, or even activist. Over time, I realized that as a feminist climate educator, my teaching is a type of activism because I'm planting seeds and shaping minds. And this also promotes the feminist idea of how the personal is political and the political is personal. And also it pays homage to the long history of Black educators in the South who were fighting for liberation, who are fighting for human rights, who are fighting for civil rights within and outside of the classroom. So as a feminist climate activist, environmental educator, I have many pedagogical principles which are listed here, and some of them include the need for interdisciplinarity. I am an undisciplined scholar, educator, activist. Also the need for interconnectedness, critical perspectives, and collaboration, the need to embrace queerness, fluidity, tolerance for difference, and also the idea of Sankofa, which is using the past and understanding of cultural identity to plan for the future and also hopefully heal intergenerational trauma. I also identify as part of the second generation of critical environmental justice. So if you're not familiar with David Pello's work, I definitely encourage you to check it out. He talks about the evolution of the first generation of environmental justice scholars who focused on race, class, often employed statistics, quantitative analysis, and how the second generation currently focuses more on gender, sexualities, and species, also once again employs interdisciplinary and new methodologies. And this is really exciting for me because just to be honest, my approach was not always respected within the academy. And it's really nice to be a part of a legacy of a canon that's growing, that's pushing back at how we actually do scientific research and abolitionist research. Also, I think it's really important that Dr. David Pello discusses 4 principles of critical environmental justice, which is really important to how I think of my methodology and my pedagogy, which is really about praxis. So I see them as linked, they're not separate. And he discusses how critical environmental justice focuses on multiple forms of inequality. So when the idea of Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality is super important. Also, the idea that critical environmental justice utilizes multi-scalar analysis, which is important for me as a autoethnographer. So I focus on multiple sites of intervention, including the body, so embodied knowledge, talking about regional and local interventions, and also transnational solidarity. So my work with the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal, work with folk in these UN or these international climate negotiation spaces. And then finally, he talks, or I should say discusses the importance of critical environmental justice taking an anti-authoritarian approach, realizing that the state is actually complicit in perpetuating environmental harm, even when the state is actually tasked with ameliorating environmental harm. And also that many frontline, fence line communities push back at this idea that they're disposable, even if they're located in toxic communities or sacrifice zones, and that actually their freedom and liberation is required for everyone's health and well-being. So I currently utilize eco-womanist methodology as part of my praxis. And so eco-womanist methodology was developed by Reverend Dr. Melanie Harris. And then really it's a 7-step spiral methodology. The steps are interchangeable. And some of these, and some of the principles of this methodology include honoring, experience, and recovering eco-memory, which is really important when we talk about autoethnographic reports as a pedagogical strategy. Also the need for womanist intersectional analysis, the need to critically examine history, spirituality, and tradition. So we're centering spirituality within environmental classroom, within environmental sciences, and also the need to take action for earth justice through teaching eco-womanism. So once again, getting at this idea that environmental educators are actually activists. Finally, I would say I'm really, really inspired by the work of Southern activists who have identified and defined the need for healing justice and holistic security. And so here are some slides really that are taken from the website for the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice, which is a really innovative fund that I'm actually on the advisory board, or recently joined the advisory board, which is focusing on funding women, queer folk, frontline communities in the Southeast, the Gulf South, and focusing on the Gulf South and the Mid-Atlantic region. And they talk about this need for healing justice. So healing justice as a framework was developed by Southern activists, particularly after unnatural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina and Rita, also by folk in human rights and disability studies. And it's this idea that we have to support BIPOC communities, particularly BIWOC folk, as they heal, transform, um, uh, the contours of these environmental violences, and as they reimagine what it means to heal from intergenerational and ongoing trauma. Also, healing justice is particularly important because it pushes back at this idea that, I should say that at this idea that gendered and racialized care labor doesn't matter. And it really centers self-care as earth care. And so I would say that healing justice and really promoting holistic security, because when we talk about healing justice, not just the health, self-care, the collective care, is also about like the digital practices when you're dealing with harassment and bullying, and and also just harm from patriarchal institutions and individuals. But healing justice and holistic security are really important for post-traumatic growth and resilience. So there's many different definitions of resilience and many different disciplines, but for our purposes today, we're gonna discuss resilience in reference to the ability to bounce back after a traumatic event. Obviously, there's many critiques of this idea, as folks say that, it perpetuates harm, and we think that communities can constantly bounce back, and that actually we need an anti-resilient approach where we're actually not trying to return to the status quo, but trying to transform these violent institutions and systems. And also this idea of post-traumatic growth, which is really this idea of a need for uh, positive psychological change, personal growth, and shifts in thinking as a result of healing from intergenerational, intersectional, cumulative trauma. And this term, or this, I should say, theory, as coined by psychologists, is really exciting for me and folk on the ground here, I would say in Gulf Coast, Louisiana, who are thinking about healing justice or healing as revolution. And some of the characteristics of post-traumatic growth include, a renewed appreciation for life, also I should say more robust relationships with others, a better understanding of new possibilities in life, and then finally, appreciation for personal strength and personal change. And so in my own work as an ethnographer and autoethnographer, I realized that women of color, Black and Indigenous women in Gulf Coast Louisiana, were engaging youth as a key strategy of resistance. So we saw folk who were engaging youth in environmentally themed high schools, such as New Harmony High, teaching courses on environmental science and even environmental racism, and intersecting a critical feminist climate analysis, which you don't always see, is definitely not stipulated in K through 12 curriculum or even higher ed curriculum. Also, we saw Gulf Coast Black and Indigenous women engaging youth in summer camps, discussing the need for food sovereignty, food justice. Also, folk engaging youth around flooding, sea level rise, and green infrastructure projects. And then even folk encouraging their own children to get engaged politically through lawsuits against the federal government. And I was really excited about my work with once again, the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and I should say facilitating workshops on feminist climate justice at the HBCU Climate Change Conference, which is an annual conference. And so here I just have some, I'm very visual, some photos of just like uh, the expansiveness of my fieldwork season. So you can see me here participating in a march for the Rise for Cancer Alley, which has been renamed Death Alley. And also you can see me once again facilitating workshops at the HBCU Climate Change Conference, interacting with environmental justice greats such as Dr. Beverly Wright, Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who coined the term environmental racism, and the father of environmental justice, Dr. Bob Bullard. And then also you can see here some of my students who participated, and I believe this was the 2019 HBCU conference, and they were just so excited. And this was also an opportunity for them to consider environmental careers and connect and network with different universities and other institutions for internship opportunities. And so some pedagogical reflections. So after teaching courses at, once again, Tulane, Bard Early College, and the University for Peace in Costa Rica, I realized that centering storytelling was really radical, that autoethnography allows students to think creatively, allowed them to unlearn, co-learn, and relearn. And also, I should say that autoethnography allows students to really focus in on the multiple scales of environmental, energy, and climate justice, and how the personal is indeed political. I also would say that my pedagogical strategies encourage students to increase their digital citizenship. It expanded their critical landscape literacy when they were able to visualize solutions and inequality through, for example, an Instagram assignment, through using geographical information systems, also through photographs and maps. And I should say like hard copy maps. Many of my students had never used a hard copy map because they're just of the generation with iPhones. Also, how teaching as activism really contributes to conscientiation. I had students who emailed me after, like, for example, one of my courses and said, "You inspired me to become a digital organizer for the Sunrise Movement." Also, how field trips to, for example, the Hurricane Katrina Museum allow students to process trauma. Some of my early college students were young children when Katrina hit, and they had just a lot of memories they hadn't had the opportunity to discuss in public. And so it was a very cathartic experience. And I also just wanted to pinpoint that my pedagogical strategies are constantly evolving. So I've used Instagram in the past, poetry, environmental autoethnographies, timelines, debates, blogging, comics, podcasts, dance, and even analysis of city planning documents. Now, I want to focus a bit on one of my favorite pedagogical strategies, the autoethnographic report. And once again, this is inspired by Reverend Dr. Melanie Harris' work, who promotes autoethnographies, and also, I should say, she promotes climate covenants, and encourages students to create manifestos of their visions for the future. And so this was, excuse me, a really transformative assignment, which allows students to really focus in on their own biographies. And this was hard work. A lot of folk are not used to centering subjectivity or even integrating subjective experiences with environmental policies and even, you know, academic writing. And so through this assignment, I encourage my students to, of course, you know, excavate their own eco memories, but also to interview family members, to also, you know, maybe interview activists that they really admire, and also to include academic citations. So, you know, it's a fun, transformative assignment, but it's also very challenging. And so here I just have some examples of the autoethnographic visual components, and the also some of the writing that my students produce. So you can see a collage that one of my students produced, really talking about his own journey as a self-identified cisgendered white male, coming from, I believe, the Boston area, to his work in like Costa Rica, and just all of the, and his understanding of how his own positionality can perpetuate inequality, and also the need to center other voices. Also, I have an example here of one of my other students who wrote about eco-anxiety and emotional resilience. And I really just thought this was a really beautiful quote, where she says, "Nature is a great teacher. Just observe what happens when someone cuts down a tree. New life blossoms from the bare trunk. We can do this too. We can start again and again and again." And so I just thought that was really beautiful, and just showing how students are really thinking critically about many of the very theoretical, jargony ideas that, frameworks that we were going over in class. So I mentioned earlier that I also had an Instagram assignment. So here are just some examples of the posts that my students created in our Environmental Racism Matters account. And so students are talking about the dumping of tires, for example, in New Orleans East, and the lack of affordable housing and gentrification and dilapidated housing after in the post-Katrina landscape, and even the lack of affordable food options. And I really love this assignment because, in addition to increasing students' critical landscape literacy, many students shared these posts with their parents, with their friends. Many came to me and said, I never saw injustice in the built environment. Now I can't unsee it. And so I just really, and actually I can't even take credit for this particular assignment, because I'm part of the Site Black Woman Collective. So this assignment was also inspired by, I believe, Tony Griffin, who has a Design for the Just City collective, who's a city planner. So once again, these visual spatial tools are really, really important. Also, I mentioned civic engagement. So in addition to taking my students to Hurricane Katrina exhibit at the Louisiana State Museum, I also had students visit Jackson State University to learn more about undergraduate opportunities in meteorology and geosciences. Also, students were able to visit youth farms, and even uh, learn more about green infrastructure and the connection to food sovereignty and edible landscapes when they were able to plant okra, lavender, and eggplant at Groundworks NOLA Earth Lab. So let's talk about some pedagogical challenges and violence in the classroom. So once again, as I mentioned, excavating eco-memories is a really time-consuming and emotional process. I've had some students who really embraced this project, and other students who just um, are not used to doing that emotional work. We oftentimes think of emotions as soft skills. It's not. It's really hard, especially when we've been brought up uh, in institutions that ask us to just to engage in rote memorization and regurgitate information, and have just emphasized testing. So to have students actually engage emotions is really hard, because they're like, where's the test? Where's the multiple choice? Also, I would say that many students uh, or I should say, some students tend to take creative pedagogical approaches less seriously. There's a stigma that it's not real academic work. And then I would say that teaching in post-Katrina charter schools presented its own challenges. Like, I had to write grants to ensure that there was transportation so that students could participate in field trips. Also, I experienced digital harassment and bullying from students and parents. And so here you can actually see, um, I mentioned our Environmental Racism Matters Instagram account, and you can see here one of my students actually hacked into the account and changed the name, and was just very ugly. They also wrote a really nasty blog post filled with expletives, because of the fact that the institution lacked care infrastructure, and the student was processing a lot of different emotions, and all of that got projected on me. Also, I should say that teaching, virtual teaching in the post-COVID landscape can present its own challenges, because once again, there is this increased demand for mothering. Students have a lot of emotions around climate, but also COVID and just um, the uncertainty that brings, and then also political instability. When I was teaching at one particular institution, I had students who were dealing with a coup d'état, and so it was very I tried my best to accommodate them, but at the end, due to a lack of Wi-Fi access and and their own need to uh, practice self-care while engaging with an actual coup, they weren't able to successfully complete the course. And so there's going to be more examples or many more instances where students are just dealing with real life situations, and it's just really hard to practice care in those environments. And then also, finally, I would just say really quickly, I've been thinking a lot more about what does it mean to promote transnational solidarity in virtual classrooms, because a lot of times we teach in environments where our students are coming from many international contexts, and so the care that you provide in a classroom in person, like for example, I tend to buy food for my students. I'm always providing food and snacks. I can't necessarily do virtually, and then I find that sometimes students can uh, perpetuate harm when they reify these binaries, sometimes between like the global north and the global south. And so what does it mean to promote transnational solidarity if you're located in the global north and you're seen as the enemy, regardless of the intersectionalities of your identity? And so I just have a few more slides, but I just wanted to conclude with the importance of setting boundaries and clapping back at students who are honestly just perpetuating misogyny and misogynoir. And so I had one particular student who took it upon herself to constantly challenge me in and outside of the classroom, to turn students against me, to just, you know, everything I said she wanted to challenge and resist, and not in a healthy way, in a very methodical and violent way. And so I think for the first few weeks, I extended a lot of grace because as environmental educators, that's what we're taught to do. But I think at the end of the day, I realized I'm also an activist, and I'm also a Black woman. And I'm also a person who is sensitive and someone who demands that folk treat me with care and kindness and gentleness. And so I eventually had to not only write multiple letters to administrators, but also, as we say, clap back at this particular student and her violence. And also encourage her to reflect on how she was engaging in know your place aggression, and how that is just completely unacceptable. And also how her demands as a woman of European descent really was following into this stereotype of being a Karen, and you know how that's just unacceptable. And at the same time, how I still provided a lot of love and care for her because I wanted to use it as a teaching moment. And so I know many of you might be interested, well, what happened with this situation? At the end of the day, she was a very hard worker and she earned an A in my class. But she actually was just so upset with me that she wrote a complaint and went to the ombuds office. And the ombuds office actually said that they're surprised I didn't write a complaint against her. But once again, this bad behavior was allowed to fester because other educators did not put her in her place because of the idea that we have to accommodate all student needs. But I would say, in the spirit of self-care for students and professors, we can't allow students to perpetuate violence, even in this post-COVID landscape. And so moving forward, I plan to continue to develop my eco-womanist practice for a multi-scalar community engaged scholarship. I will continue to cite Black women, cite Indigenous women, cite BIPOC scholars on my syllabi. And also I will continue to promote feminist care economies and digital storytelling because, as I mentioned earlier, self-care is earth care and healing justice is a type of divine resistance. And so to conclude, I hope that I don't have all the answers, but I hope I've provoked some thought on what it means to be an environmental educator, a feminist climate activist in this post-COVID landscape, some of the challenges and opportunities to plant seeds and also transform minds and systems, and also just the need for solidarity and support infrastructure, care infrastructure, particularly for environmental educators. And that is, for me, we say that care jobs are green jobs, support infrastructure is green infrastructure. And so if you're interested in learning more about my work, I'm constantly writing. I have some articles that are will be coming out soon, but I've already written recently a chapter in the Mapping Gendered Ecologies anthology. Also, I've written for Anthropology News and Edge Effects on my research and what it means to be a Black feminist environmental ethnographer. And so please feel free to reach out to me. I can be reached on my website, blackandgreenphd.org, also on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And I have a few questions, which we don't have to go through all of them, but just a few questions for provocation about what are other feminist tools outside of social media, also autoethnographies that you can utilize to promote care, post-traumatic growth, healing, justice. Also, what are some of the challenges and opportunities for addressing the violence that will continue to be perpetuated by parents, students, and administrators? And then also, how can we promote creative and abolitionist pedagogies when that challenge students, when institutions just fail to support emotional resiliency, fail to provide emotional resources, and just lack psychosocial resources? And finally, is it time for environmental educators to periodically and strategically leave the classroom? So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Frances. This is incredible. And I just want to make sure you had listed a number of resources there at the end. So I'm posting your website in the chat right now if anybody wants to click on that and follow up on those readings. So I imagine that we have, just based on the chat here, things are blowing up. Lots of questions, input, ideas, connections. If you go ahead and raise your hand, we'll start with Lisa Kretz.
Sorry about that. First of all, oh my goodness, thank you for such a wonderful, rich, multi-layered presentation. I took so many notes. This is actually related to your last question. Oh, and I also wanted to thank you for the work you do, because it takes an incredible amount of emotional and psychological strength. So I appreciate you. So what do you do with the question of how to work against an institution from within an institution? So if we're talking about academia as a white supremacist patriarchal institution, and you gave some wonderful suggestions about curriculum, but that last question, like, do we have to be leaving the classroom? I'm curious about what your thoughts are, and when we need to do that. And the other question I had was with regard to eco-womanism, which in principle I'm completely sympathetic to, but as a queer theorist, I worry about the terminology of woman, particularly with non-binary students and the like. So I'm curious how you sort of resolve that in your work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa, for those questions and thoughts and observations. So to begin, I would say that, well, I think that, okay, well, I'll start with eco-womanism because that's what's that's what's in my mind right now. So I think that all of our terms can be seen as works in progress, and also sometimes words might be problematic for some. And so I don't ask that all my students identify as eco-womanists. or even eco-feminist. And I have many students who identify as queer, and I often talk about the importance of queer ecologies, and also queerness as a theoretical tool, and methodological position. And so, I mean, at times I identify as a queer theorist, but sometimes I don't. So so anyway, all that to say that, like, yeah, words can be limiting, but I always say, let's go beyond the words into the work. And so no matter how you label yourself, are you focused on liberation? Are you focused on abolition? You know, like, I mean, it's like the terms within the, I would say, Black studies or just different Black communities. Some folks say I identify as a feminist, and some say I identify as a womanist, and folk debate which term is more appropriate. I mean, and I always say, go back to Alice Walker, a womanist is a Black feminist. And so I think that we have to understand the histories and the context of these terms were developed, but also understand that that you have the right to identify how you want. There's another important text on the emergence of Afrocentric eco-womanism by Shamara Shantu Riley. And it's been really hard to find a lot of information on this particular author, but from my understanding, she didn't identify as a queer woman. And so that's not necessarily apparent, but when we talk about her positionality in writing this like manifesto. And so I would say that there's no separation between, or I wouldn't say there's necessarily conflict between womanism or eco-womanism and queerness and queer ecologies. And then also we focus on the experiences of women of African descent, women of color, but at the same time, it's an evolving definition. So like, it's not to exclude folk who identify as non-binary or femme-bodied. It's just more about let's focusing on centering these marginalized perspectives. So I hope that answered that second part. And then the first part of your question, can you repeat it again? Because I just forgot.
I'm feeling guilty taking up so much time, so feel free to, because that was a really thorough answer to the second part. But basically, when does the oppressiveness of the institution that we're working within, when do you butt up against that such that you have to get out of the classroom, such that the learning cannot happen within that context?
Yeah, I mean, this is once again maybe a controversial position, but it's a personal choice. I know it might mean leaving a particular institution because all institutions aren't created equally. Also, it means rethinking what does it mean to engage in environmental education. So like, I learned a lot of my political conscientiation occurred during internships, which is technically outside of the classroom during like the summer months and the breaks. And so it might mean that you're engaging youth, during the summer, or outside of your classroom. I do know environmental educators who are thinking about other sectors. So I mean, I don't have a great answer, but it's provoking me because I've dealt with so much violence, and I didn't talk about all the violence I've experienced with my positionality and with my feminist climate perspective. And so, not to say that I'll leave the classroom forever, but I might actually, for self-care reasons, have to periodically leave for rest and recovery, because hurt people, and I don't want to inflict violence on my students because I'm resentful of how of other violences I've experienced it. So rest and recovery makes the work more sustainable. So I can either burn out in a few years, or I can have a career that lasts a couple decades, but also has periodic seasons of recovery.
Thank you. So Merrick, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Frances. I love your presentation. I love the work you're doing. I'm so impressed. This is just fantastic. I have a question about this environmental autoethnography assignment you mentioned. So you showed us the questions so can you talk more about how spread over time the assignment is? Then you bring it in class, like do students share it? Because some of the stories might be kind of personal. And then of course we enter this space where students do the assignment because it's for class, but not necessarily want to share it with everyone, or maybe just share it with you, but not with peers. Like, so how do you handle these situations? How does it work in practice?
Thanks so much for that great question. So I introduce it on the syllabus the first day, and then I have mandatory drafts that are due periodically throughout the semester. So I might say like half of the assignment is due at this time, and then I provide feedback that they can incorporate in subsequent drafts. And then during our final class, we actually have, because it's a written component and a visual component, so they present the visual and their written component on the final day of class. Each student has like 5 to 15 minutes, depending how many students are present. And then as a class, we give feedback, and then they incorporate all of that feedback into what they finally submit for grading. So there's built in all of these opportunities for feedback, and also to help students deal with their procrastination, because I'm a procrastinator, so I understand that. And then I agree with you. A lot of students, I also have students write blogs on the different readings that we have assigned. And oftentimes students do share personal information, or even come to my office hours and share a lot of personal information. Like, I remember one student who said, your class like made me realize that I need to embrace my queerness and my identity. And so it was like a coming out movement. And so that was beautiful. But obviously I didn't ask them to write about that or present about that in class. And so students are always given the option to present what they're comfortable with. And so there's so much that memories for them to analyze, that they actually within 5 or 15 minutes cannot talk about everything they even write in their final report to me. And so publicly, they have the option, the agency, to focus on what's most important and what they feel comfortable sharing. So I hope that answers all your questions.
It does. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Greta, see your hand up also.
So thank you so much for this talk, which is so powerful. And I did take a couple screenshots, and because your assignments were so good, really. And so I hope that you are going to publish an article that is this talk, so that we can actually cite something other than the talk, if we advance your ideas and share them. But your talk also made me realize that I'm of the generation of David Pellow and not of your generation. And so I wonder if, I hope that the older tools are still helpful. And so I wanted to pull out, this is a book that we did in 1996. It's called Anti-Feminism in the Academy. Veve Clark was the lead editor from UC Berkeley. And it talks a lot about class and gender and sexuality, but not so much on race. And it's really time, if you think about the, who am I thinking of, the woman who was fired from Michigan for doing the indigenous work, Andrea Smith, she had, the work she did is still a huge contribution, whatever her identity is or isn't, and everybody in ethnic studies was with her, and everybody in women's studies was against her. Oh my goodness. Horrible. And I wanted to show the book that you're in.
Oh, thank you.
A lovely book and a lovely chapter. So this kind of both like updates to your generation ecofeminism and makes it richer, wider, deeper, more complex, and also more accessible in language, like big theory, ordinary words. Like you could assign this to students and they would get it, Yes, thank you for that tool. So I think about the slow scholarship and slow professor stuff, and your idea of taking breaks is audacious self-preservation, because the academy requires crucifixion. And please don't agree to that. Your work requires you to be alive. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. First of all, that was just so warm and kind. And also, I'm fangirling right now because I'm like, Greta Gard, wait, I assigned you on my syllabi. Hold up. So thank you so much. Like, I'm lost for words. Like, and also thank you for promoting, as someone said in the chat, audacious self-preservation, because it's hard. It's really hard. It's very emotional, but I want to make this long, sustainable work. And anyway, oh, Greta Gard, that's exciting.
Oh, these moments. Great. Okay, so let's get Terry Harpold and then Panu Pikola, please.
Hi, Frances. It's really good to hear once again this important and exuberant work you're doing, which is immensely appealing and obviously consequential. One of the bullets in your final slide was, what does I think I've got this right. What does abolitional pedagogy look, taste, and smell like? I want to talk about taste and smell. I'm curious about that because what it suggests is that look is therefore not a metaphor for just, its mode of being, but rather a literal encounter that's embodied. So could you talk a bit more about why you brought, at least at the end of the talk, this language of embodiment and immersion in the body into that question to all of us?
Yeah, so good to see you again, Terry. Embodiment is a key part of my praxis as an autoethnographer, and also this idea of critical environmental justice, where it's multi-scalar. So embodiment is so important. Also, feminist STS perspective, and I think that when I think about my own research and how it evolved over time, I've mentioned, I think in other presentations, how it was actually for me salsa dancing with petroleum engineers that reframed my research questions. I was like uncomfortable, but yet desiring the best dance partners who were petroleum engineers. And it made me think, well, if I'm feeling these incongruencies and these contradictions and an unpleasant desire, how are folk who were born and raised in Louisiana, how are they dealing with family members who work in these industries? How are they thinking about their own activism when activism might be seen as a bad word? So yeah, embodiment is so important. And I mean, when I think about I would love to know what everyone else thinks about what it looks, tastes, feels, smells like. But when I think about what it tastes like, I mean, for me, I do think about the importance of food as a way to provide care, also to simulate really interesting conversations, and also just like indigenous and local foodways, how important that is for me when I think about climate justice. So like, bringing in, making sure that my students are aware of like some of the local chefs and like the importance of even like rice as a cultural staple, but also important in memory work when we talk about hurricane preparedness. I also think when I talk about smell, I think that it can be funky. It can be it doesn't have to always smell good. I love smelling flowers, all of that, but like we might need to go to a wastewater treatment plant, there's many different smells that are involved in liberatory climate justice. And I think that it's all about embracing the messiness and the contradiction. So embodiment is really important. I want folk to have cathartic experiences when they're engaging these topics.
Thank you. Okay, Panu.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Helsinki. Thanks, Frances. That was touching and excellent. So I wanted to comment with the concept that I think is closely related, which is that of scapegoat ecology. I don't know if you folks have come across that. There's some nice articles about it, and Tim Jensen's book about ecologies of guilt has good discussion about it. But basically the idea is that in order to try to distance themselves from a complex topic, people have this tendency to shoot the messenger or perform scapegoating. And unfortunately, gender and color have been major issues in scapegoating throughout most of recent history. And it seems that now with all the distress generated by the COVID, it's gotten worse, because there's so much distress that if people just can find somebody to project it into, and that came to my mind when listening to your talk. So just wanted to mention this concept of scapegoat ecology, and it has a complex relation to guilt, and I very much appreciate your message of taking care of oneself, because it's very important to not to submit to these scapegoating processes. Thanks once more.
Thank you so much. I'm definitely about to look that up. I hadn't heard of that before, but yeah, that's like really important. I love that folk from multiple walks of life and academic disciplines and geographies are thinking about these ideas. And I love here that we're creating a shared language. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Great. Any other questions from the group? Comments, input, ideas? Yeah, Linda.
Yeah, I'm curious, Francis, about the students that you work with, what level they're at, and whether this is an elective, you're teaching elective courses that you might get a broad range of people stepping into, or if it's more within a particular department.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So it varies. So I taught high school, early college. I taught undergrad, which was freshmen to seniors. And then I also taught master's level students, so graduate students. And so my courses are electives. They're always electives. So I've taught communications department, cross-listed with environmental studies. I've taught like an interdisciplinary environmental science elective, and then also elective for peace and sustainable development. So yeah, they're elective courses. And so students who are really interested in these topics tend to opt in. And so it would be interesting if like this was like part of like core curriculum, you know, but yeah, at this time, yeah, I'm usually an elective.
And when you do, for example, the autoethnographic exercises, have you done it at a lot of different levels?
Yeah, so I've done it with all of my students from high school to master's levels.
And are they introduced to the idea of it being a methodology, of it being autoethnography as opposed to another kind of narrative or something?
Yeah, so I definitely try, but I think, you know, depending on where students are, some of them embrace the message. Some of it might be a bit over their heads, depending on where they are. But I do introduce it. I, you know, always say that this is a method that's experimental, improvisational, feminist, also creative, that it's often used by anthropologists and social scientists, Black feminists. And so, like I said, most students, some students, they complain, you know, students love to complain. Oh my goodness, they love to complain. But then at the end, they're like, oh, this wasn't that bad, or oh, I really love this, and this transformed the way I think. So I'm very sensitive. I'm working on being a people pleaser. And so I've learned over time not to pay attention to complaints, because unless it's like something serious, because growing pains, folk are going to complain when they're experiencing growing pains, but that doesn't mean that it's not really important.
And it's different, right?
Yeah,
so
different.
Right there, right? Which is good.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we have room for one more question. We're coming up on 10 o'clock, but Brooke Suter, you have your hand up. Let's hear from you.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer. Boy, Francis, that was just amazing. And I loved hearing you've been in New Jersey. I did a lot of work with Kim Gaddy and folks like that in my years of environmental activism. And so about 25 years of that. And then doing some work recently at Harvard and MIT with auto and sort of embodied systems change. And looking at the eco-anxiety question, we've had some interesting conversations in this group about the concept of easing eco-anxiety. And clearly, eco-anxiety can be a motivator, which is, I believe, a positive thing. It can also be debilitating. I think the reaction is different depending on an individual person's resiliency and nervous system and predispositions. So I'm just curious if you have a thought on in the classroom. So I think about it in the classroom and in, for instance, environmental meetings. I'm thinking about ways to, I believe it would be helpful to ease the debilitating element of eco-anxiety, the nervous system activation, because when you're coming into a classroom or you're coming into a meeting, you're coming there to make some progress, to get something done, to have a conversation, to move things forward. And I'm just curious if you have a thought about the degree to which easing eco-anxiety is helpful or not helpful, or do you simply sort of land in the same space? For some people, we need to help ease it, and for others, it's fine because it's an activator.
Wow. So thank you so much for that question. That's a great question. I feel like there's probably a diversity of thought on that, even within this group, who some of our even past presenters for this existential toolkit. I would say that I always want to ease anxiety, but I also believe in providing folk with the tools to help themselves. And I've learned over time, you can't be more invested in someone's healing than they are. And so that's a really tough one for me because no one wants to see someone just suffering unnecessarily. But once again, I think I always make myself available to students, and not even the students, parents as well. And, provide tools. I think in past presentations, folks talked about the importance of meditation and just many, many different practices that can support that psychosocial growth. But once again, I can't be more, for my own self-preservation, I can't be more invested in their well-being than I am in my own. And I also can't be more invested than they are. And so I just try to provide a space where folk always know I'm available if they're willing to do that hard work. And I support them in doing it, but also allowing them to have agency and make their own choices.
Thank you so much for all your work, Frances, and for that answer.
Welcome.
So this has been incredible. I want to ask all of you to join me in thanking Frances, and please do follow up by visiting her website and her readings and this incredible work that she's doing. And I hope that we'll get to see you again in this circle, Frances. And I also want to make sure to invite everybody to the end of the month. I believe it's on the 30th, and I'll be sending out an email soon, for our next guest facilitator, Krista Heiser, who's going to be joining us from the University of Hawaii system. So thank you again, Frances, and thanks to all of you for joining and for this really lively conversation. And if anybody missed anything in the chat, send me an email directly, and I'll make sure to send you a copy of the chat transcript, and you can follow up on any of those sources. All right. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much. So excellent.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.